Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm actually a software developer by trade, so this is my first procurement conference. I've been to many software ones, so very excited to be here. So as you said, I'm going to talk about open data for procurement. And I have my speaker slides on one computer and my actual slides on another computer, so this will be fun. Also, they were designed for a widescreen, so they might look a little smushed, but the whole presentation is online, and there's a link at the end, so if you ever want to look through it in its original grace, you can see it. So this is the Sunlight Foundation. This is our whole staff, basically, in front of the DuPont Circle Fountain in Washington, D.C. As Dermot said, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We're about 50 people, with 20 of those focusing on technology and building tools around government data. We spend most of our time advocating for government transparency, especially around campaign finance and federal spending data, which is actually my kind of area of expertise. So as I said, I started as a software developer, and I was working with these huge data systems around federal spending, and we're talking about maybe hundreds of millions of rows. And I started becoming an advocate to try to make the data better because it's extremely difficult to work with. And my more recent focus has been on procurement data. And I have also led our contracting kind of research and development team. So this is a little squished and hilarious looking. But this is just a few examples of our work. There's a ton on our website on sunlightfoundation.com. We've done several international case studies to look at transparency in public procurement. That one is from the Slovak Republic. We've done kind of landscape mapping and research on procurement at the local and municipal level in the US, all across the country. And we took our open data guidelines, which are more broadly for governments to come up with their open data policies, and we adapted them specifically for procurement data. So that's kind of a little preview right there, and you can see some of them. So to talk about open data more broadly, irrespective of procurement, it basically has these 4 attributes. It's available for use and reuse and distribution by anybody for basically any purpose. It's readily available, and by that I basically mean it's on the internet, which is how everyone accesses things these days. And it's in a format that is conducive to data. So I have machine readable on the slide, which I realize is kind of a software developer term. But that is essentially using a structured format like a spreadsheet or a database instead of a Word document or a PDF. So those are formats for pros, and they're not really conducive to data. And in addition, those formats are themselves licensed. So it can be very difficult as a software developer to work with those to extract data from them. On the data itself, it's not encumbered by licensing restrictions. So as a nonprofit in DC, I don't have to pay a $20,000 license to work with some of this data and do research on it. It doesn't require registration or identification even. And I'm looking at the TED site for that because they have a kind of hilarious multi-website registration process, which I'm not quite sure how that works. But that also just inhibits reuse, especially in an automated way. So if I'm building software tools around this, it's very difficult to negotiate that kind of authentication process sometimes. So what does this specifically mean in the context of procurement? So that's all nice and well, but what do I really mean? So firstly, information on solicitations and awards. It's very common to see solicitations and tender announcements and things. Sometimes awards will fall by the wayside, but both are really necessary if you want to make the data truly open. The participants in the process. So who are the registered vendors, the potential contractors, who's on the exemption list for small businesses or minority-owned businesses, who's been disbarred or suspended. Information on those entities is also really important. Data on contract disputes or bid protests. This can often tell us a lot about the performance of a contract, and also contract performance and execution. So was it on time? Was it on budget? How did the actual contractors perform? So I'll talk now a little bit about what is kind of out there today, just what we've seen from our research. Electronic portals like TED or in the US like FedBizOps are very common. They usually have the solicitations kind of in some format. It's not usually available as data. So I could potentially write a program to go and kind of screen scrape, like download the actual HTML pages and try to extract information from that. But it's extremely brittle and difficult to maintain. Most of the time it's piecemeal. It doesn't contain information on the whole process end to end. So they might have solicitations, but they might not have information on protest or performance information. The performance information we noticed is something that is really lacking kind of across the board. We really couldn't find a lot of good examples of jurisdictions that make this information available, certainly not publicly. Some of them do have government-only or private databases for that kind of thing, but it's certainly not something that is public. All right, so that's open data and open data for procurement. But why should anyone in this room care what me, Kaitlin Devine from the Sunlight Foundation, has to say about this? First of all, it has huge potential to attract a more diverse bidding pool. It's often difficult to get bids that are from the most qualified companies, not just the companies that are most qualified in your bidding process. So there's a substantial cottage industry, and this is certainly true in the US and probably other countries, of companies that just navigate procurement. So they kind of are a middleman that smaller companies pay to help them get through the process. Usually the smaller companies don't have the staff or the capital to kind of navigate that. So by democratizing access to this information, you can attract bidders who haven't traditionally participated. You can get better access to prices paid outside of your own jurisdiction. So if everyone is kind of reporting data on what they paid for an HP 3700 printer, it makes it a lot easier for different jurisdictions to get a better price on it. And I actually have a nice example of this that I'll show in a few minutes. Not just sharing information on the pricing data, but also contract vehicles. So in the United States, a lot of states have provisions where they can use a contract vehicle from a neighboring state. So if there is some kind of relief effort, let's say a natural disaster, most places have provisions for expediting those contracts, but if you want to make sure you're still going through a competitive process, you can get quick access to information about your peers and your neighbors and potentially use those vehicles so that you're still competing it. Having this open data will allow for uninhibited and extremely cheap, i.e. free, third-party innovation. I'm going to go over some examples. Also, one of the things that I've noticed in my work is that procurement staff in governments tends to be stretched very thin, and that is even more true of the staff responsible for the oversight. So by opening up a lot of this data, you can distribute that burden across the public, journalists, public advocates like the Sunlight Foundation, and even other contractors. So if I was contracting on something, you can bet I would be researching the performance of my competitors. It also makes it easier to identify bad actors. So often the departments that house a lot of this important information about procurement are not the same departments that host information about workplace safety violations, criminal violations, environmental violations, or other things like that. But as a government, you probably don't want to be subsidizing companies who do that on a regular basis with your procurements. So opening up your procurement data is going to make it easier and more interoperable with these other kinds of data that are hugely important to the process, but tend to be siloed off in different departments. So this is, I'm going to go through a few examples. This is SmartProcure, and so this is essentially a prices paid portal across a bunch of different jurisdictions. So the way it works is, if you're a government, you can get access to it for free as long as you provide your own data. So you can kind of see on the left side here, maybe, kind of. So there's Montgomery County, the US General Services Administration, so that's the federal level, a bunch of different cities, Austin, University of Virginia, a bunch of different entities that procure. And on the right, this is a search for water cooler. So you can see what they paid for it, when they paid for it, and things like that. There's also a whole bunch of other stuff that they have for market analytics and things like that. I think the founder is actually a former policeman who was doing procurement at his police force and realized that he's buying all the same things as his neighbors but paying wildly different prices. This is RFPEasy. So this is actually a project of fellows from the Presidential Innovation Fellowship, which is a program at the US federal government where they take industry hires usually from IT or software, for 6 or 12-month stints. And they kind of work on these projects very in like an agile startup methodology. And this was a portal that they built dedicated to small businesses and making it easier for them to find solicitations and get solicitations. And they posted the same solicitations here as they posted on the historical government-wide portal, which is FedBizOps. So the thing that they've been using for 20 some odd years, as well as this new project. Got completely cut off. But so on the right is a graph that's in their press release. And essentially, the bids were 30% lower than average. And they attracted 270 businesses that had never procured with the government before. And this is from running, I think, an 8-month pilot. So they had some pretty drastic results from a really short amount of time. This is another one. This is RFP365, which is this is the bid authoring tool. So it has a side for government and for contractors. This is basically kind of like a WordPress or blog-like back-end interface for completing your bid, making sure that you have all of the required elements that have been identified by the solicitation, and just kind of has it in a nice format with alerts and other things like that. This is Horde from a company called GovTribe. It's actually an iPhone app, so this is 3 screenshots of the iPhone app side by side. And this is basically just used to track procurements mobily. So what's going on with a specific procurement? So here, George Washington has hoarded one procurement and is keeping track of all the updates on it, when it gets canceled, what things are recommended for him based on things that they've bid on in the past. And then there's a specific project in the middle, and on the right is kind of a more broad trends view. So the really great thing about all of these companies, which are, like I said, all in the last 1.5 year to 2 years, they're all small startups, and their average number of employees is 3.5. So they're able to make these products extremely quickly with a very small staff. And the reason they're able to do that is because they don't require a huge engineering team to take the data, scrape it from a website, process it into some kind of usable format, then start building the analytics platforms that I've just shown you. And that's what traditional procurement intelligence firms do, right? They take an army of people, they sift through data, they produce analytics, and in reality, a lot of that could be automated simply by making the information available in open formats. And so this makes the analytical products cheaper, easier to build, and more accessible to companies that don't necessarily have the capital. So some of the things that allow them to do this, so real specific attributes of how the data is published and released. So it's timely, and it's data, not documents. So being able to know that the information that you release as data is going to be comparable in time, and when it's released with other information, is going to make sure that they're getting the most up-to-date information possible. It's also the more consistently you release it, and the more predictable the schedule is, the easier it is to build a business model off of it. So it's really hard to build a product on something that is updated really infrequently, or you kind of have to just guess when they're going to update it. Using predefined data fields and like kind of cross-jurisdictional data points. So having predefined data fields is kind of the difference between that Horde application being able to say, hey, there's a new procurement, and hey, there's a new procurement for a thing you've bid on in the past that's also targeted towards small business, which you should apply right away. And so having all of that extra, sometimes it's called metadata, but you could just say structured data, is really the difference between having something that is rich in context and something that is just kind of meh, it's just an alert, that's fine. Documenting the data, so it might seem kind of like an obvious one, but having a data dictionary so that your users can use it and know what the data means. Okay, so that is kind of the state of open data now, and how it can be useful. But I want to talk about something I see as kind of the future of this and what should really be focused on going forward, and is also one of the least transparent aspects of procurement, which is the contractor performance data. So I talked about it before, not being available in many places, certainly not publicly. And like I said, this is a huge problem because contracting officers and also oversight officials tend to have trouble keeping up and are traditionally understaffed. So I just want to talk about kind of a quick example of that, and hopefully it's not, people aren't sick of it yet. But healthcare.gov is one of the kind of most public failures of procurement in the US recently. As many of you probably know, they launched this website in October to help everybody get healthcare, and it crashed instantly. Immediately, the web server just kind of like fell over and died. It took months to fix, and it's still not actually completely fixed. The main contractor on the site was CGI Federal. So what most people might not know is that CGI Federal had also previously failed at implementing a tax revenue system in North Carolina, exchanges in Vermont and Massachusetts, and also the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, which is essentially the retirement 401k savings plan for the entire federal government. And the reason that this was difficult was because the information sharing across jurisdictions wasn't good, so sharing between the states and the US wasn't very good. Some of them will have confidentiality agreements when they break a contract, so they can kind of maintain their reputation even though the performance isn't so great. But also, CGI Federal used to be known as AMS. And when AMS was, the federal government essentially knew that AMS was a bad contractor, and they would have probably been prevented from procuring further, but they were rebranded as CGI Federal. So CGI Group purchased AMS, rebranded them, and then the contracting officers weren't really able to tell that CGI Federal had not only contracted with them before, but had done a terrible job. So not only was the lack of information a problem, but also they didn't have the ability to properly vet this contractor because they couldn't track that basically their doing business as name had changed. And had the information been public, probably competing contractors with better records might have noticed this during the award process and filed a protest, or somebody else might have noticed it sooner. So why couldn't they notice that the company changed their name and be able to identify them as the same contractor as before? And this is something that affects a lot of areas, not just procurement, but it has implications for money laundering, patent ownership, financial markets, just a bunch of things, is that there is really no good way to identify legal entities in terms of companies and also their corporate hierarchical structures. So this is actually a really somewhat difficult problem. It's boring also, but it just is at the intersection of so many things that I felt like I had to kind of bring it up specifically. So if you're just tracking companies by names, it's often really difficult to tell, are they the same company? Are they different LLCs? Are they different branches? Has that subdivision of a company been sold to another one but kept the name, which happens a lot with like Lockheed Martin or like Boeing, you know, they'll create a division and sell it off. So having a unique identifier for companies, regardless of what their doing business as name is critical to providing procurement oversight and making sure that a company's past performance stays with them. This is a funny zoomed-in version of it, but this is a website called OpenLeyes. And this is sort of an implementation of an effort that I want to highlight, which is the G8 countries and the Financial Stability Board in the wake of the financial crisis basically got together and was like, it's impossible for us to identify systemic risk in financial markets. If Goldman Sachs buys part of Lehman Brothers, and Lehman Brothers owns these other 10 legal entities, and they have a certain amount of risk or risky assets associated with them, we have no way of automatically, let's say, summing that or aggregating that to know what we're buying or what we're buying into. And so they kind of got together, and they're creating this distributed system. So they will register different registrants. So you can have local registrants that can give legal entity identifiers to companies. And they're also going to be required to track the hierarchical information. So there are a few business intelligence firms that do this right now. So Dun & Bradstreet is one, but their DUNS number is proprietary, and you have to pay a license to use it. I think the federal government pays like $50-something million a year to use those identifiers. But they're also not very good. A lot of information is self-reported in a way that is not accurate. So so if you want to learn more about it, you can go to openleis.com. And this is just kind of a search interface that is built on top of the LEIs that have already been registered. In the US, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission is already registering companies. And what their, I guess, enforcement mechanism is going to be is that to participate in financial markets, you're going to have to get an LEI. And in my work, I have been trying to encourage more and more organizations to look at using the LEI as a way of identifying either contractors. So in the US, instead of requiring them to get a DUNS number, require them to get an LEI. The Patent Office is also looking for how to track the ultimate owners of patents, which I don't know if people are familiar with patent trolls and kind of what's going on in the US with software patents. But actually figuring out who ultimately owns a patent is quite difficult. And so we've been encouraging them to kind of look at this system and think about adopting it. So that's my pitch on that. And this is just a resource slide that has a lot of the links for things that I went over. And the last link is actually a link to this presentation. So you can access that. And that's my name and email. So you can feel free to email me with any questions. And that's it. Any questions?
Okay, that was extremely interesting. Okay, some questions. I think we heard a lot of different ideas. There are different ways of approaching things. Transparency of data. I really like the point about, because we were talking about it yesterday, contract performance. How do you monitor performance? How do you identify poor performers? And while you've shown a way to do it, you've also shown there are big legal difficulties and practical difficulties, but also suggested a way to overcome them. So that's extremely interesting. Okay, some questions, comments? Yeah.
I just have one question. When are you expanding into Europe?
We do have a small international program. Our contacts tend to be in Eastern Europe. There tends to be a lot of, I guess, procurement reform there, I guess as part of their requirements for entrance into the EU. But, yeah, email me. I'll put you in touch with our international coordinator. Yeah.
Because as you mentioned with TED, there are a lot of challenges, not just on the registration side, but also the quality of data that's in TED. It's hugely challenging when we try and do analysis of what's happening.
Yeah, I had actually worked with, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the OpenLeyes Foundation. They're actually based in the UK, and they have branches kind of all over the world. But I had worked with some of their developers who are based in Europe, Berlin, on trying to get that data and do kind of a data quality analysis of it, see like what fields are missing all the time. And just getting that data was extremely difficult. Like I said, the registration process is hilarious, but also a lot of websites specifically disallow robots, aka software programs, which is kind of silly because it also means Google can't crawl your site and then your site will never show up in search results. But so getting around a lot of that is tough, and also a lot of times they'll just block you outright. They'll block your IP address, so you kind of have to have your program hop around to different servers and do that. But yeah, I tried to kind of do that with them, and we're like, oh yeah, let's collaborate on this. And it was like, oh, the data is just not there. Like there's literally not enough of it to do a data quality analysis. It would just be completely flawed. Like, it wouldn't be meaningful.
Okay, we've got a question over here.
Sure.
So I'll agree that the United States data system is very, very easy to criticize. We're obviously disaggregated. We've got federal, we've got state, we have all these different systems you pointed out. I think I heard you talk about Fed Biz Ops, you have USA Spending, you've got FTDS, all these other things. I guess my question is, even assuming the US has problems, how's that stacking up to the rest of the world? And is there anybody who you see who's basically working towards a model that you think is productive?
The Republic of Georgia. So the US has theirs is really dispersed and kind of all over the place, but they do have a lot of data available, and it's relatively easy to get access to. But the Republic of Georgia actually just redid their whole e-procurement system, I think last year, and they worked extremely closely with Transparency International, the Transparency International branch in Georgia, TI Georgia, and so they literally have nothing on paper anymore, and they're kind of working through this huge legal entity identifier issue with the guy who created the website that I showed. So that's Chris Taggart, who runs Open Corporates, and he's also based in the UK. So they're working with him through a lot of the efforts. A lot of those are just funny little language barriers, basically. So they're working through a lot of that and tracking performance. So I would definitely look at them as, theirs is really good, Slovakia is really good. Like I said, I don't know, all these Eastern Bloc countries are just coming out of the woodwork with these great procurement portals, but yeah, Georgia is great.
Great. Another question. Now you were talking about the qualities that good data should have, and you said that alerts are not good data. They have unstructured data. There's no. What did you mean by that?
That alerts are not good data. Well, just that alerts aren't rich. So there's a difference between just getting an alert that a new procurement is available and one that is targeted specifically for you. So if that procurement has, there's some piece of data somewhere that says what industry it's in and what agency it's in, and has a keyword tag. So just having extra information that augments the basic solicitation helps software developers, like some of the people I showed, or myself, build tools that make it easier for people to participate in that process, which I think is one of the main goals of making this data more open, that and the oversight goal. But I can talk more specifically about it too if anyone has questions.
Yeah, now you also talked about data needing to be in open format. What did you mean by that, and why is that significant?
Open format meaning that nobody has license restrictions over it. So technically Excel is not an open format because Microsoft has licensing restrictions on that, but CSV, a comma separated values file, is. Nobody owns the copyright over CSV. It's just a format where the fields are separated by commas. So if the format is licensed, then you're unnecessarily limiting the people who can participate in using that data. You're requiring someone to buy some specific software to be able to open and inspect and interpret that data. And so that's just not really open data. So open data is anybody can use it, not just people who can afford to buy this license for this program, for this arcane database that may or may not exist anymore, and someone has to go, find a developer who can use it. So using a format that is open and unlicensed, I think is really key to all of the examples that I showed.
I mean, I think what's really interesting about your analysis is the way in which you've shown how there's transparency, so you can see what people are paying for different things in different states, which are technically different jurisdictions. So that's interesting. But also we've had big problems here with huge contracts with for example, the UK government, to do with the Olympics and security. A lot of the companies awarded those contracts might not have been in the running if this kind of information had been publicly available, because we now know, because of parliamentary inquiries, they've had significant poor performance across a range of other major contracts. And that leads to serious loss for the taxpayer and deprival of services for the citizens. So this is very interesting work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think that hiding your past performance is a sustainable business model either. So, just kind of doing that and putting more eyes on it in this way is going to root out people who, they're focusing their investment resources and business resources on that instead of making their model better.
How do public bodies take it then when poor performance that they have been involved with, in other words, a contractor they have hired, that company you spoke about there, who delivered all of these poor performing contracts? How does the public sector body deal with this when all of this information is available? Do they see this as empowering, or do they see this as a challenge?
So I think it's a challenge. So even though the performance information is not really widespread, not available widely in the US, it is technically available within government. And I think a lot of the problem is that the contractors who design the systems to help maintain the performance data are also really bad. So they just don't really have very good tools at their disposal to be able to identify these companies. And they have kind of a weirdly subjective rating system. So I think it's like unsatisfactory, satisfactory. And it doesn't happen throughout the life of a contract. So it's very common for that to be rated at the very end. And if you have a contract that's 10 years, rating it at the very end isn't necessarily a great idea. Rating it maybe every year and reevaluating is a better idea. Steve has a question.
Because I think this is a terrific point you may want to elaborate. On the past performance issue, you might want to explain to people that the government is generating the data. And one of the problems is busy government people don't want to take the time and effort to evaluate the contractors, don't want to criticize them. So it's garbage in, garbage out, which is one of the fundamental flaws that you have to deal with.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you incentivize government people to get good data in the first place so that you can get the results you want?
Well, I think they should track analytics on who's entering data and why not. I mean, they don't want to enter it in, but they also have a statutory obligation to fill it in. So, I mean, they're legally required to do so. So if they had some better tools in place to not only report the performance, but this contractor, so if this data is more open, it's a lot easier to mash up. So I can look at the data available publicly and say this contractor awarded, I don't know, 10 procurements in the last 2 months, but they haven't fulfilled it, filed any performance reports in the last 2 years. And that would be really easy for someone like Sunlight, if all that data were open, to come in and just be like, oh, here's our shit list of contracting officers who didn't do their job. So again, that's what my point about making the data more open so you can distribute this oversight burden more is really important. And the other thing about the US is hilarious because there's one system where they rely on contracting officers to fill it in for past performance. And there's another system where contractors have to self-report when they have violated like labor laws or something in the course of a contract. They don't even have to report it if they violated it outside of the existing government contract. If they didn't do it in the context of that contract vehicle, they don't have to report it. Also, it's self-reported. Who would report that? That is the most hilarious model I ever heard of. Yeah.
Can I just give you a bit of a perspective on performance data? In Canada, there is a requirement for government ministries to conduct performance assessments. I'm not going to mislead you, they're not always completed. But the ones that are completed, even to the best of the person's ability, become meaningless. Because they're being done for the sake of being done, and there's not a lot of thought about what's being assessed. And it's a typical performance evaluation. What we're asking the program authority or the contract authority to do, above and beyond what they're currently required to do, is to sit back and ask themselves some fundamental questions before the procurement has taken place. We're asking them to say to themselves, if this procurement is successful, what will that look like? And what performance indicators will I lay out to measure that success? It's yet another layer of bureaucracy that we're putting on, and it's required, but it's a huge struggle to get program managers that are, their imperative is to get their program delivered, and procurement officials whose imperative is to get the procurement out the door to do yet another task. So it is useful, it makes good common sense, but it's a huge challenge to get done. It's just a huge challenge.
Yeah, and I do think that some of this, not all of it, I mean, you brought up some really good points, but some of it can be addressed with data. I mean, it would be easy to to systematically determine which procurements have been over budget or over time and immediately flag those and require a review. So requiring that information, I think, is not necessarily as subjective, or it's not pros necessarily. It's not like they're writing this big performance review, but filling in a few of these key indicators can help trigger the further review.
Yeah, those are good indicators, but the next level is how well did this, usually a service provider, perform? And that's the struggle, and it's nothing to do with data. It's the front end thinking of what does success look like, and how do we measure it when it's delivered? That's a hell of a struggle for program managers and procurement officials to do. It's not your issue. It's just an issue that we're struggling with in Canada.
Yeah, I actually had an idea recently that any contractor who built a website, their name should be publicly available somewhere, and I should be able to fill out a Yelp review for how much I like or dislike that website.
I suppose the key thing here is that if the information is available, it allows others then to act on the information. You're talking about spreading the burden. What you're really saying is the more transparency there is, the more that useful questions can be asked, and that's how progress takes place.
Right, and that's how, I mean, oversight authorities that are outside of the normal contracting avenue. So, like in the U.S., they have the General Accountability Office, is in Congress, and their job is to oversee some of this stuff. But rather than go doing this huge data call and trying to figure out where are the pressure points that they should do research on, it's much easier if they can just have that data and immediately have it be alerted to it.
We'll take three questions together. Make it short.
Yeah, in the UK, several of us have ISO 9001, and what's remarkably challenging is in a closed-loop system, if you are the service owner commissioning something, but you can't find the time to write out this £1 million procurement result, then you're just transferring the workload to the hard-pressed procurement profession down the corridor. So actually, if the procurement parties operate the same closed-loop feedback system as some of their contractors have to do, and they agreed perhaps to share the evaluation so that it was countersigned, then that would be an open system that helps all parties, because the contractor gets an obvious reference and the procurement people save time because they know who the good and the baddies are.
Okay, you got that question?
I just wanted to pick up on Frank's point about what kind of data and people not entering the right kind of data. And my concern there would be what kind of incentives are created for officials especially when they enter data, because the quality of the data and the subjective opinions that go into that quality, one must be able to scrutinize that. I mean, it would be grossly unfair if data could be entered based on subjective opinion and a contractor would not be able to challenge that. But that may have an adverse incentive effect back into the administration, which I think may be problematic. So I think one needs to be quite careful about how information is going to be used, that's going to be entered.
Okay, good, Kath.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in practical terms of how this might work in Wales and to ensure that we have consistency and quality of data going into the process. I'm just thinking about a Welsh purchasing consortium contract being let in one authority, but then maybe having, how would the information across all the participating organisations feed into that in a meaningful way so that the data is shareable with integrity? And I don't know that we've got the systems in place that would support that quality of information, but it's just a thought.
So it sounds like kind of a running theme is that making the data open to everyone has the side effect, side benefit of making it open everywhere within government, which is also kind of an issue. In terms of, I'll just pick up the last question first. So how to build and maintain systems so that this is available is basically your question, or?
Well, my question is around if one organisation lets a contract on behalf of many others, it's how that data across, in terms of contract performance, is put into the system, and how we can ensure that there's a sort of equality of treatment, that it's not subjective. And how is the quality of that data then?
Yeah, I don't know if I can give great feedback on how exactly a performance rating system should be designed. I feel like that's something that's sort of outside the scope of this talk, but I see what you're saying is you have this decentralized entry of information, how to make sure that it's consistent, that all the procurement officers have the same opinion of how this went.
And maybe I think that's the key, is that we do have the same monitoring and performance system to start with before we...
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that is a separate question, but also really important, and which goes to Hugh's question. But I think it's probably, in my mind, would be a combination of subjective and objective ratings, especially because if you have something that's subjective, it's basically impossible to aggregate. And you have a huge contractor who's done thousands of procurements for the government, and maybe they were good on some and bad on others. Should they be eliminated? I don't know. But you're like, well, their average is this. So let's go pull some of the most recent subjective descriptions. So I would think that would be, the best system is going to be a combination of the two. But yeah, obviously being consistent and having really clear guidance on what that should be is super important.
Great.